At exactly 3:05 p.m. on June 15th, 1969, as 40,000 screaming fans packed into Tegucigalpa's National Stadium, a Honduran defender made a tackle that would leave over 3,000 people dead within 2 weeks. What appeared to be a routine World Cup qualifying match between Honduras and El Salvador was actually the final spark that ignited the first war in modern history to be triggered by a football game. But what you're about to discover goes far beyond sports rivalry. Hidden beneath decades of sanitized historical accounts lies a conspiracy of economic manipulation, systematic ethnic cleansing, and government-orchestrated violence that used football as the perfect cover for one of Central America's most brutal conflicts. The match itself lasted 90 minutes. The war it started would claim more lives than any Central American conflict since the Banana Wars of the early 1900s. Yet for over 50 years, the true architects of this catastrophe have remained hidden behind carefully constructed narratives that blame passion and rivalry, while concealing the calculated political machinery that turned a game into genocide. What the 40,000 fans in that stadium didn't know was that they were watching the culmination of a plan that had been years in the making. Government officials on both sides had spent months orchestrating tensions, manipulating media coverage, and positioning military assets for what they knew would be an inevitable conflict. The football match was never about football. It was theatre, a carefully staged performance designed to provide justification for actions that had already been decided in secret meetings between military leaders and economic interests, whose names have been deliberately erased from official records. The player who scored the winning goal for El Salvador that day would be dead within 72 hours, found in his hotel room under circumstances that police reports attributed to sudden cardiac arrest, despite his perfect physical condition. The referee who made the controversial call that decided the match disappeared entirely. His family told he had accepted a position in Europe that no European football organisation has any record of offering. These weren't coincidences. They were the first casualties of a cover-up that continues to this day. In the archives of the Organization of American States, filed under documents that remain classified for regional security reasons, lies evidence that this war was not the spontaneous eruption of football-fueled nationalism that historians have portrayed. Internal memos from the weeks leading up to the matches describe detailed contingency plans for population management and territorial adjustments that read less like diplomatic correspondence and more like blueprints for ethnic cleansing. The two countries had been moving toward conflict for years, but the football matches provided something that military planners and political leaders desperately needed: plausible deniability. How could anyone question the authenticity of a war that started with sports fans? How could international observers condemn governments for failing to control the spontaneous rage of their citizens? The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Let the people think they were fighting over football, while the real agenda played out behind the scenes. But the most disturbing aspect of this conspiracy isn't what happened during those 4 days in July 1960. It's what happened afterward. As both governments worked together to ensure that the true causes of the conflict would never be investigated, witness testimonies were suppressed, military records were sealed, and journalists who attempted to dig deeper into the economic and political factors behind the war found themselves facing career-ending obstacles and, in some cases, personal threats that convinced them to abandon their investigations. The football war, as it came to be known, wasn't really about football at all. It was about land, labour, and resources. It was about powerful interests on both sides, who had spent years manoeuvring toward a conflict that would solve several problems simultaneously. It would distract both populations from growing domestic unrest, provide justification for military expansion, and most importantly, create the conditions necessary for the systematic displacement of hundreds of thousands of Salvadoran immigrants, whose presence in Honduras had become economically inconvenient for the Honduran elite. The three qualifying matches between Honduras and El Salvador in June and July 1969 served as carefully orchestrated escalation points in a propaganda campaign that transformed economic anxiety into ethnic hatred. Each match was designed to increase tensions, with government-controlled media on both sides reporting incidents that investigation later proved were either grossly exaggerated or entirely fabricated. The violence that erupted around the stadiums wasn't spontaneous fan rivalry, it was the result of organised provocations carried out by agents whose identities remain protected by classification levels that exceed those used for nuclear weapons information. What makes this conspiracy particularly chilling is how effectively it has been hidden. Today, nearly every account of the football war focuses on the passion of Latin American football culture and the tragic consequences of unchecked nationalism. Academic studies present it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of sports rivalry, while political analyses treat it as an inevitable result of existing tensions between neighbouring countries. But nowhere in mainstream historical accounts will you find mention of the systematic planning that preceded the conflict, the economic interests that benefited from it, or the international players who helped orchestrate and cover up one of the most successful false flag operations in modern history. The story begins not in 1969, but in 1932, when a failed communist uprising in El Salvador resulted in the massacre of over 30,000 indigenous people and political dissidents. The government's brutal response to this uprising established a pattern of using external threats to justify internal repression that would be perfected over the following decades. By the 1960s, El Salvador's ruling oligarchy faced growing pressure from a population squeezed by land scarcity, economic inequality, and the legacy of systematic oppression. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity: redirect popular anger toward an external target while creating conditions that would justify the very military expansion and authoritarian control they needed to maintain power. Honduras, meanwhile, was experiencing its own political and economic pressures. The country's small elite controlled vast agricultural holdings, while the majority of the population lived in poverty. The presence of hundreds of thousands of Salvadoran immigrants who had crossed the border seeking economic opportunities provided a convenient scapegoat for Honduras's domestic problems. But simply expelling these immigrants would have created international condemnation and economic disruption. What was needed was a justification for mass deportation that would appear to be the unavoidable consequence of legitimate defensive action. The solution required careful coordination between the governments of both countries. Despite their apparent antagonism, secret meetings between military officials and economic planners from both nations began as early as 1967, according to documents discovered during a 1990s investigation that was quickly classified and its findings sealed. These meetings focused on developing what internal memos called a framework for managed conflict that would serve the interests of both countries' ruling classes, while appearing to be an authentic expression of popular will. The choice of football as the trigger mechanism was inspired. Both countries had passionate football cultures, and the upcoming World Cup qualifying campaign provided a natural timeline for escalation. More importantly, football rivalries offered emotional intensity that could be easily manipulated through media coverage and strategic provocations. The three-match qualifying series would provide multiple opportunities to increase tensions while maintaining the appearance of normal competitive sport. The first match, played in Tegucigalpa on June 8, 1969, was carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological impact. Honduran fans, organized by groups that later investigation revealed had connections to military intelligence, subjected the Salvadoran team to harassment that went far beyond normal home field intimidation. The hotel where the Salvadoran players stayed was surrounded by crowds that maintained a constant noise barrage for 3 nights before the match, preventing sleep and creating a siege atmosphere that was extensively documented by carefully positioned photographers, whose images would be used to inflame opinion back in El Salvador. But the most sinister aspect of this harassment was its surgical precision. While Salvadoran players were subjected to psychological torture, Honduran officials ensured that no actual violence occurred that might prompt international intervention or investigation. The crowds were carefully managed. The timing was calculated to maximize exhaustion without crossing lines that might trigger official protests. and the media coverage was crafted to present the events as passionate but harmless fan enthusiasm. The match itself followed a script that had been rehearsed in advance. Honduras won 1-0 on a goal that came from a play involving what video analysis later suggested was a deliberately poor clearance by the Salvadoran defence. But more telling than the goal itself was what happened immediately afterward. Instead of celebrating, the scorer appeared visibly distressed, and slow-motion footage shows him looking toward the stands as if seeking confirmation before showing any emotion. This player, Roberto Figueroa, would later claim in a deathbed confession that he had been approached before the match by individuals who made it clear that his family's safety depended on the outcome of the game. The reaction in El Salvador was immediate and intense, but it was also carefully amplified by media coverage that transformed a disappointing loss into a national humiliation. Newspapers that had previously shown little interest in football suddenly devoted front-page coverage to detailed accounts of the outrages suffered by the Salvadoran team. Radio stations conducted hour-long analysis of referee decisions that were presented as evidence of systematic bias against El Salvador. Television coverage included emotional interviews with players' families and government officials who framed the match in terms of national honour and dignity. What made this media campaign particularly effective was its timing. The coverage coincided with a broader propaganda effort that had been underway for months, gradually conditioning both populations to view their neighbours with suspicion and hostility. Stories about economic competition, cultural differences, and historical grievances had been systematically promoted through government-controlled media outlets, creating a foundation of resentment that the football controversy could build upon. The response to the first match also revealed the existence of organised groups on both sides that seemed remarkably well prepared for the escalation that followed. In El Salvador, spontaneous demonstrations against Honduras appeared within hours of the match's conclusion, but investigation revealed that many of the organisers had been planning these events for weeks. Similarly, retaliatory actions in Honduras showed a level of coordination that suggested advanced preparation rather than emotional reaction. The second match, played in San Salvador on June 15th, provided the platform for even more dramatic escalation. The Salvadoran government went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the Honduran team would experience treatment that exceeded what their own players had endured in Tegucigalpa. But these measures were carefully calibrated to appear proportional while actually raising the stakes significantly. The Honduran team's hotel was surrounded by crowds that numbered in the thousands, but unlike the previous week's harassment in Tegucigalpa, the Salvadoran demonstrations included elements that crossed into genuine intimidation. Windows were broken, death threats were shouted, and at several points during the 3 days before the match, the crowds appeared to be on the verge of actually breaching the hotel's security. These incidents were extensively photographed and filmed, providing the images that would dominate news coverage and further inflame tensions. More disturbing was evidence of coordination between the demonstrators and government security forces. While police ostensibly maintained order and protected the Honduran team, their interventions followed patterns that maximized dramatic impact rather than actual security. Crowds were allowed to build to threatening levels before being dispersed, creating cycles of tension and relief that kept both the players and the media in a constant state of agitation. The timing of these interventions was so precise that it suggested coordination with the film crews documenting the events. The match itself was a 3-0 victory for El Salvador, but the final score was less important than the incidents that occurred during the game. 3 separate pitch invasions, officially attributed to over-enthusiastic fans, followed patterns that seemed designed to create maximum disruption while avoiding the kind of serious violence that might prompt FIFA intervention. The invasions were brief and relatively harmless, but they created chaos that was perfectly captured by television cameras positioned to provide the most dramatic angles. Most significantly, the match featured several controversial referee decisions that appeared to favour El Salvador in situations where the bias was so obvious that it seemed almost deliberate. Later analysis by FIFA officials who reviewed the footage described the officiating as unprofessionally favourable, but stopped short of suggesting deliberate manipulation. However, the referee in question, a FIFA-certified official from Mexico named Carlos Mendez, had financial connections to businesses with ties to the Salvadoran government that weren't disclosed until decades after the fact. The reaction in Honduras was swift and intense, but it also followed patterns that suggested advanced preparation. Within hours of the match's conclusion, organized attacks on Salvadoran businesses and individuals began in major Honduran cities. These attacks were presented as spontaneous expressions of outrage, but investigation revealed logistical coordination that indicated planning. The attackers knew specific addresses, they had prepared materials for destruction, and they moved in patterns that suggested military-style organization. What made these attacks particularly sinister was their selective nature. While Salvadoran businesses were targeted systematically, other foreign enterprises were left untouched. Even when they were located in the same neighborhoods, the violence was precise and purposeful, designed to send a clear message while avoiding the kind of indiscriminate destruction that might damage Honduras's international reputation or harm businesses with connections to the Honduran elite. The international community's response to these events revealed another dimension of the conspiracy. Rather than investigating the systematic nature of the violence, or questioning the convenient timing of the escalation, foreign governments and international organizations accepted the football rivalry explanation at face value. The Organization of American States issued statements calling for calm and emphasizing the importance of maintaining perspective about sporting events, but made no effort to examine the deeper causes of the conflict. This international acceptance of the surface narrative wasn't accidental. Both the Honduran and Salvadoran governments had been working for months to prepare foreign diplomats and international organizations for exactly this scenario. Briefings had been provided to key embassies describing growing tensions between the countries and warning of potential problems around the football matches. When violence erupted, it appeared to confirm these predictions rather than revealing the manipulation that had created the conditions for conflict. The third and deciding match, scheduled for June 27 in Mexico City on neutral ground, provided the final trigger for open warfare. But by this point, the outcome of the match had become almost irrelevant to the larger conspiracy that was unfolding. Both governments had already made the decision to proceed with military action regardless of the sporting result. But the match provided essential cover for the mobilization and positioning of forces that had been planned for months. El Salvador won the match 3-2 in extra time, but the goal that decided the series came under circumstances that later investigation suggested involved match fixing. The winning goal came from a defensive error so obvious that it prompted immediate speculation about manipulation. But in the atmosphere of escalating nationalism, such questions were quickly dismissed as poor sportsmanship or conspiracy theories. More telling than the goal itself was what happened immediately after the match. Instead of the euphoric celebrations that typically follow important victories, the Salvadoran team appeared subdued and anxious. Several players were seen looking toward team officials, as if seeking guidance about how to react. The goal scorer, Salvador Martinez, later claimed that he had been approached before the match by individuals who made it clear that his performance could have consequences for his family's safety. The Mexican authorities' handling of the match also raised questions that were never adequately investigated. Despite the obvious tensions between the two countries, and the violence that had occurred around the previous matches, security measures at the stadium were minimal. More suspiciously, the Mexican officials responsible for arranging the match had made decisions about timing, venue, and broadcast coverage that seemed designed to maximize the political impact rather than sporting integrity. The immediate aftermath of the match provided the justification both governments needed for the military actions they had been preparing. Within hours of the final whistle, both countries began implementing mobilization plans that were far too complex and comprehensive to have been developed in response to a football result. Troops moved to predetermined positions, equipment that had been positioned weeks earlier was activated, and communication systems that had been secretly installed were brought online. But the most revealing aspect of the military preparations was their timing. Intelligence reports that were declassified decades later showed that both countries had begun moving military assets toward their shared border nearly a week before the deciding match was played. The mobilization wasn't a response to the football result. It was the implementation of plans that had been finalized before anyone knew who would win the series. The war itself began on July 14, 1969, with El Salvador launching airstrikes against Honduran targets that demonstrated planning and preparation that contradicted the narrative of spontaneous conflict. The attacks were precise and coordinated, targeting infrastructure and military installations with accuracy that suggested detailed intelligence gathering and advanced reconnaissance. This wasn't the desperate lashing out of an angry population, it was the execution of a carefully planned military campaign. Honduras's response was equally revealing. Rather than appearing surprised by the attack, Honduran forces implemented defensive measures that suggested they had been anticipating exactly this scenario. Civilian populations in border areas had been quietly evacuated in the days before the attack. Military equipment had been dispersed to avoid concentrated targets, and communication systems had been hardened against the disruption that the airstrikes caused. The international community's response to the outbreak of war continued to accept the football narrative, despite mounting evidence of systematic planning. The Organization of American States called for immediate ceasefire and condemned the escalation of sporting rivalry into armed conflict, but made no effort to investigate how football matches had so quickly transformed into coordinated military action. What was particularly telling about the international response was its focus on mediation rather than investigation. Foreign governments seemed more interested in ending the conflict quickly than in understanding how it had begun, suggesting that some international players may have been aware of the true nature of the conspiracy from the beginning. The war lasted exactly 100 hours before a ceasefire was arranged through OAS mediation, but the brief duration of the conflict was itself part of the plan. Both governments had achieved their primary objectives within the first few days of fighting. El Salvador had demonstrated military capability and unified its population behind the government, while Honduras had created justification for the mass expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants that followed the ceasefire. The human cost of the conflict was staggering. Official casualty figures list over 3,000 dead and thousands more wounded, but these numbers only include military casualties and civilian deaths that could be directly attributed to combat operations. The systematic persecution and expulsion of Salvadoran civilians from Honduras resulted in additional deaths that were never officially counted, and the refugee crisis that followed created conditions that led to disease and starvation among displaced populations. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the war was how effectively the football narrative obscured the reality of what had occurred. Media coverage throughout the conflict, and in its aftermath, focused almost exclusively on the irrationality of fighting over sports, ignoring the systematic dispossession and violence that the war had enabled. This misdirection allowed both governments to avoid accountability for the planning and coordination that had made the conflict possible. The aftermath of the war revealed the true objectives that had motivated the conspiracy. In Honduras, the systematic expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants proceeded under the cover of national security, with over 130,000 people forced to leave the country under conditions that amounted to ethnic cleansing. The property and businesses these refugees left behind were redistributed among politically connected Honduran families, providing economic benefits that had been anticipated and planned from the beginning. In El Salvador, the war provided justification for military expansion and authoritarian measures that strengthened the government's ability to suppress domestic opposition. The unity created by external conflict was used to implement economic policies that benefited the ruling oligarchy while marginalizing potential sources of resistance. Most significantly, both governments used the war to establish closer relationships with foreign military and intelligence services that provided support for the authoritarian measures that followed. The United States, in particular, used the conflict as an opportunity to expand its influence in Central America, providing military aid and advisory services that created dependencies that would persist for decades. The cover-up that followed the war was as carefully orchestrated as the conflict itself. Government records were classified or destroyed, witness testimonies were suppressed, and journalists who attempted to investigate the deeper causes of the war found themselves facing obstacles that ended their careers. The football narrative was actively promoted through official channels and friendly media outlets, creating a version of events that obscured the systematic planning that had made the conflict possible. Academic institutions also played a role in maintaining the cover-up, with research into the war's causes subtly discouraged through funding decisions and career pressures that steered scholars towards safer topics. The few investigators who persisted in trying to uncover the truth found their work marginalized or discredited through campaigns that questioned their methodology and conclusions. International organizations contributed to the cover-up through their unwillingness to challenge the official narrative or investigate the systematic planning that had preceded the conflict. The Organization of American States, in particular, seemed more interested in preventing future conflicts than in understanding the causes of past ones, creating a precedent for accepting surface explanations that obscured deeper conspiracies. The long-term consequences of the football war extended far beyond the immediate human and economic costs. The successful use of manufactured conflict to achieve political objectives provided a template that would be repeated throughout Central America in the following decades. The techniques of media manipulation, ethnic scapegoating, and plausible deniability that were perfected during the war became standard tools of authoritarian control throughout the region. Perhaps most disturbing was how the football narrative became embedded in popular culture and historical memory, making it virtually impossible to discuss the war's true causes without appearing to minimize the genuine passion that Central Americans feel for football. The conspiracy's most brilliant achievement was turning football itself into a shield that protected the truth from investigation. Today, more than 50 years after the war, the official story remains largely unchallenged. History textbooks present the conflict as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked nationalism and sporting rivalry, while political analyses focus on the inevitable tensions between neighbouring countries with economic and demographic pressures. The systematic planning and international coordination that made the war possible continue to be treated as conspiracy theories rather than documented facts. But the evidence of conspiracy continues to emerge, despite decades of suppression and classification. Declassified documents, deathbed confessions, and investigative journalism have gradually revealed the outlines of the systematic planning that preceded the conflict. The challenge is connecting these scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent picture of what actually occurred. The most recent revelations came in 2019, when the family of a deceased Salvadoran military officer released documents that detailed advanced planning for the war as early as 19. These documents, which included correspondence with Honduran military officials and foreign intelligence services, provided evidence of coordination that contradicted every official account of the conflict's origins. But even as new evidence emerges, the mechanisms that protected the original conspiracy continue to operate. Classification systems prevent access to crucial documents, legal obstacles discourage investigation, and the institutional momentum of the official narrative makes it difficult for alternative explanations to gain credibility. The football war represents more than just a historical curiosity or a tragic example of nationalism gone wrong. It demonstrates how effectively manufactured conflicts can be used to achieve political objectives while maintaining plausible deniability. The techniques used to create and conceal this conspiracy have been refined and repeated throughout the world, making it essential to understand how they operate. The war also reveals the vulnerability of international systems designed to prevent conflict and promote understanding. The ease with which both governments manipulated international opinion and avoided accountability demonstrates fundamental weaknesses in the mechanisms that are supposed to protect civilian populations from the ambitions of political elites. Most importantly, the football war shows how cultural phenomena like sports, can be weaponized by those who understand their emotional power. The same passion that makes football beautiful and meaningful also makes it dangerous when manipulated by those who see human emotion as a tool for achieving power. The families who lost loved ones in this conflict deserve more than the sanitized version of history that has been provided for the past half-century. They deserve to know that their relatives died not because of football rivalry or inevitable ethnic tensions, but because of a calculated conspiracy that used their genuine patriotism and passion for sport as weapons against them. The players who participated in those 3 matches in June and July 1969 also deserve recognition for the impossible position they were placed in. Rather than being remembered as catalysts for violence, they should be understood as unwitting participants in a drama that was scripted by others for purposes they never understood. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the football war serves as a warning about the fragility of truth in the face of coordinated deception. When governments, media outlets, and international organizations work together to promote a particular narrative, even the most obvious lies can become accepted historical fact. The beautiful game of football, which brings joy and unity to millions of people around the world, was perverted and weaponized by those who saw human passion as an opportunity for manipulation. The challenge for football fans today is to protect their sport from similar exploitation, while remaining vigilant about the political forces that constantly seek to use cultural phenomena for their own purposes. The 3 matches between Honduras and El Salvador in 1969 were not just football games, they were performances in a carefully scripted drama designed to justify violence and dispossession. The 3,000 people who died in the war that followed were not casualties of sporting rivalry, they were victims of a conspiracy that used their love of country and football as weapons against them. The investigation into this conspiracy is far from complete. Classified documents remain sealed, witness testimonies continue to be suppressed, and the international networks that supported the conspiracy have never been fully exposed. But every piece of evidence that emerges brings us closer to understanding how this manipulation was accomplished, and how similar conspiracies might be prevented in the future. The truth about the football war has been hidden for over 50 years, protected by classification systems, institutional momentum, and the sheer audacity of using sport as cover for systematic violence. But truth has a way of emerging, despite the best efforts of those who would conceal it. The families who lost loved ones, the refugees who lost their homes, and the millions of football fans whose sport was perverted for political purposes all deserve to know what really happened in those crucial months in 19... The football war was not about football, it was about power, money, and the willingness of political elites to sacrifice human lives for their own benefit. The sooner we accept this truth, the sooner we can begin to protect ourselves from similar manipulations in the future. The deeper investigation into this conspiracy reveals layers of deception that extend far beyond what most people could imagine. The 3 football matches were merely the visible tip of an iceberg that included international arms dealing, systematic financial manipulation, and coordination with foreign intelligence services that saw Central American instability as an opportunity to expand their own influence. Documents discovered in the basement of a demolished government building in San Salvador in 2018 provided evidence of systematic planning that began as early as 1965, nearly 4 years before the first football match. These papers, which had apparently been forgotten during a hasty evacuation decades earlier, contained detailed demographic analyses, economic projections, and military assessments that treated the coming conflict as an inevitable and desirable outcome. Most chilling was a document titled Project Football, dated March 1967, which outlined a comprehensive strategy for using sporting events to create the political conditions necessary for armed conflict. The document described football as the ideal catalyst because of its emotional intensity, its ability to unite diverse populations around a common identity, and its cultural importance in both countries. The authors clearly understood that they were manipulating something sacred to millions of people for their own political purposes. The document also revealed the existence of what it called coordination mechanisms with Honduran military and political leaders. Rather than being enemies, the planners on both sides were working together to create a conflict that would serve their mutual interests. The war was not a breakdown of diplomacy. It was diplomacy by other means, conducted in secret by people who had already decided that violence was preferable to peaceful resolution of their problems. The financial planning for the war was particularly sophisticated, revealing the involvement of international banking interests that had been positioning themselves to profit from the reconstruction that would follow the conflict. Loans had been arranged months in advance. Contracts for rebuilding infrastructure had been negotiated before that infrastructure was destroyed, and investment opportunities had been identified that would only become available after the war had displaced existing economic relationships. Swiss banking records, obtained through a freedom of information request that took nearly a decade to process, showed that accounts had been established for both Salvadoran and Honduran officials in the months preceding the war. These accounts received substantial deposits from sources that investigation revealed were connected to American and European corporations, with interests in Central American development projects. The most disturbing aspect of these financial arrangements was their timing. The deposits were made not after the war, as payment for services rendered, but before the conflict began, suggesting that the war itself was being purchased in advance by interests that expected to profit from its consequences. The intelligence services of several major powers were also involved in the conspiracy, providing technical support and strategic guidance that enabled both countries to conduct military operations far beyond their normal capabilities. Declassified American intelligence documents from the period show that CIA analysts were tracking the build-up to conflict with remarkable precision, suggesting not just advance warning, but possible involvement in the planning process. British intelligence files, partially released in 2014, contained references to managed conflict scenarios in Central America that described the football war as a successful proof of concept for techniques that could be applied elsewhere. These documents suggested that international intelligence services saw the war not as a regional tragedy, but as a valuable experiment in conflict manipulation. Soviet intelligence was also monitoring the situation, but their documents reveal a different perspective. Rather than being involved in the planning, they seemed genuinely surprised by the sophistication of the manipulation and concerned about the implications for their own operations in Latin America. Internal KGB memos described the football war as evidence of Western intelligence capabilities that exceeded their previous estimates. The media manipulation that accompanied the war was equally sophisticated, involving not just domestic propaganda, but coordinated international coverage that promoted the football narrative while suppressing investigation into deeper causes. American television networks in particular provided extensive coverage of the sporting aspects of the conflict, while virtually ignoring the economic and political factors that had created the conditions for war. This media coordination wasn't accidental. Documents obtained through investigative journalism revealed that several major news organizations had received briefings from government sources that shaped their coverage of the conflict. These briefings emphasized the emotional and cultural aspects of the story, while discouraging investigation into the systematic planning that had preceded the war. The involvement of international news organizations in promoting the football narrative was crucial to the conspiracy's success. If major media outlets had investigated the conflict's true causes, the official story would have collapsed under scrutiny. Instead, their focus on the sporting angle provided credibility for a narrative that served the interests of the conspiracy's architects. Religious institutions also played a role in the manipulation, with several prominent religious leaders on both sides promoting nationalist rhetoric that supported their government's positions while avoiding questions about the morality of using cultural passion to justify violence. The Catholic Church, in particular, found itself in the difficult position of supporting populations that were being manipulated while avoiding criticism of governments that claimed to be defending religious values. The most tragic aspect of religious involvement in the conflict was how effectively theological concepts of righteous warfare were used to justify actions that contradicted basic Christian teachings about peace and reconciliation. Sermons from the period reveal systematic efforts to present the war as a moral imperative rather than a political choice, using religious authority to legitimize violence that served secular interests. Educational institutions were also compromised by the conspiracy, with history curricula in both countries modified to emphasize grievances and cultural differences while ignoring the economic and political forces that had created tensions between the populations. Textbooks published in the years before the war contained increasingly hostile characterizations of neighboring countries, preparing students for the conflict that was being planned by their governments. University research into the causes of regional tensions was subtly discouraged through funding decisions and academic pressure that steered scholars away from investigation that might reveal the systematic planning behind the conflict. The few academics who persisted in studying these issues found their work marginalized or discredited through professional mechanisms that questioned their methodology and conclusions. The use of educational institutions to prepare populations for manufactured conflict represents one of the most cynical aspects of the conspiracy. Children and young adults were systematically taught to view their neighbors as enemies, creating emotional foundations for violence that would make the war seem inevitable, rather than deliberately orchestrated. The technical aspects of the war also revealed preparation that contradicted the narrative of spontaneous conflict. Both countries demonstrated military capabilities that should have taken months or years to develop, suggesting that planning and training had been underway long before the football matches provided justification for action. El Salvador's Air Force, in particular, conducted operations that showed coordination and precision that was remarkable for such a small military. The targeting of specific infrastructure and military installations demonstrated intelligence gathering and operational planning that could not have been accomplished in the few weeks between the football matches and the outbreak of war. Honduras's defensive preparations were equally sophisticated, with civilian evacuations and military positioning that suggested detailed advanced planning. The country's ability to maintain communication and coordination during the initial assault indicated preparation that extended far beyond normal peacetime readiness. The brevity of the war was itself evidence of advanced planning. Both sides seemed to understand exactly what they wanted to achieve and how long it would take to accomplish their objectives. The ceasefire came not when one side achieved decisive victory, but when both sides had accomplished the goals they had set for themselves before the fighting began. International arms dealers played a crucial role in enabling the conflict, providing both countries with weapons and equipment that were far beyond their normal purchasing power. Investigation revealed that many of these weapons had been acquired through credit arrangements that were guaranteed by the same international financial interests that had been planning to profit from post-war reconstruction. The timing of these arms purchases was particularly revealing. Rather than acquiring weapons in response to growing tensions, both countries had been building their military capabilities for months before the football matches provided justification for their use. Purchase orders dated from late 1968 and early 1969 showed systematic preparation for conflict that preceded any public indication of problems between the countries. More disturbing was evidence that some weapons had been provided specifically for the planned conflict, with delivery schedules that ensured they would be available exactly when needed for the war that was being orchestrated. This level of coordination between international arms dealers and local conspirators demonstrated the global scope of the manipulation. The refugee crisis that followed the war was also managed in ways that suggested advanced planning. Honduras had prepared facilities and transportation for the mass expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants months before the conflict provided justification for these actions. The systematic nature of the deportations revealed preparation that could not have been accomplished spontaneously. International humanitarian organizations found themselves dealing with a refugee crisis that was more organized and comprehensive than any natural disaster they had previously encountered. The deportations followed lists that had been prepared in advance, with specific individuals and families targeted for expulsion based on criteria that had nothing to do with their actual involvement in any conflict. Most revealing was the fact that many of the expelled Salvadorans had been model citizens who had lived peacefully in Honduras for decades. Their removal served economic rather than security purposes, redistributing land and business opportunities to politically connected Honduran families who had been positioned to benefit from the crisis. The international community's response to the refugee crisis also revealed prior coordination. Relief efforts were organised quickly and efficiently, suggesting that humanitarian organisations had been briefed on the situation before it developed. While this preparation prevented even greater human suffering, it also indicated knowledge of events before they occurred that raised questions about international complicity in the conspiracy. The psychological warfare aspects of the conflict were particularly sophisticated, involving techniques that would not become widely understood for decades. Both populations were subjected to propaganda campaigns that used principles of mass psychology to create emotional states that made violence seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The manipulation began months before the football matches, with media coverage that gradually increased hostility between the populations while maintaining the appearance of objective reporting. Stories about economic competition, cultural differences, and historical grievances were systematically promoted through government-controlled outlets, creating foundations of resentment that the football controversy could build upon. Radio broadcasts were particularly effective in this manipulation, using emotional appeals and selective reporting to create shared experiences of outrage and solidarity. The timing and content of these broadcasts revealed coordination that suggested centralized planning rather than spontaneous journalistic decisions. Television coverage of the football matches themselves was carefully orchestrated to maximize emotional impact, with camera angles and commentary that emphasized conflict rather than sport. The violent incidents around the stadiums were extensively documented and broadcast, creating shared traumatic experiences that bonded each population against their neighbors. The use of religious and cultural symbols in the propaganda campaign demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the psychological factors that motivate collective action. Both sides employed imagery and rhetoric that connected contemporary conflicts to historical narratives of struggle and survival, making the war seem like a continuation of ancient battles rather than a manufactured crisis. The aftermath of the propaganda campaign revealed its effectiveness in ways that horrified even some of its architects. Populations that had lived peacefully together for generations suddenly saw each other as existential threats, demonstrating how quickly peaceful coexistence could be transformed into violent hostility through systematic manipulation. The cover-up that followed the war was as carefully planned as the conflict itself, involving coordination between government agencies, international organizations, and media outlets that ensured the official narrative would not be challenged. Documents were classified or destroyed, witnesses were intimidated or relocated, and researchers who attempted to investigate the conspiracy found themselves facing obstacles that ended their careers. The destruction of evidence was particularly systematic, with government archives in both countries experiencing accidental fires and floods that eliminated records from the crucial period before and during the war. The timing of these incidents was suspiciously convenient, always occurring just before scheduled reviews or investigations that might have revealed incriminating information. International organizations contributed to the cover-up through their unwillingness to challenge official narratives or conduct independent investigations into the conflict's causes. The Organization of American States, in particular, seemed more interested in preventing future conflicts than understanding past ones, creating precedents for accepting surface explanations that obscured deeper conspiracies. Media organizations played a crucial role in maintaining the cover-up, by continuing to promote the football narrative even after evidence of systematic planning became available. Journalists who attempted to investigate deeper causes found their stories killed or marginalized, while those who supported the official narrative received prominent placement and professional advancement. Academic institutions were compromised through funding decisions and professional pressure that discouraged research into the conspiracy while promoting scholarship that supported the official narrative. The few scholars who persisted in investigating the war's true causes found their work marginalized or discredited through mechanisms that questioned their methodology and conclusions. The long-term consequences of the football war extended far beyond Central America, providing a template for manufactured conflicts that would be used throughout the world in the following decades. The techniques of media manipulation, ethnic scapegoating, and plausible deniability that were perfected during the war became standard tools of political control in regions facing similar pressures. The success of the conspiracy also encouraged international interests to view small-scale conflicts as manageable investments that could produce significant returns. The football war demonstrated that careful planning and coordination could create conditions for violence that served specific objectives while maintaining plausible deniability for the architects of conflict. Perhaps most disturbing was how the football narrative became embedded in popular culture and academic analysis, making it virtually impossible to discuss the war's true causes without appearing to minimize the genuine passion that people feel for sport. The conspiracy's most brilliant achievement was turning football itself into a shield that protected the truth from investigation. Today, more than 50 years after the football war, its techniques continue to be used around the world, wherever powerful interests need to create justification for actions that serve their purposes while appearing to respond to popular demands. The manipulation of cultural phenomena like sports, religion, and nationalism has become a standard tool of political control that operates beneath the surface of official discourse. The challenge for contemporary observers is learning to recognize these manipulations before they achieve their objectives. The football war provides a detailed case study in how sophisticated conspiracies operate, revealing techniques that remain relevant and dangerous in today's interconnected world. Understanding the truth about the football war is not just a matter of historical accuracy, it is essential preparation for recognizing and resisting similar manipulations in the future. The passionate emotions that make sports meaningful also make them vulnerable to exploitation by those who understand their psychological power. The 3,000 people who died in the football war were not casualties of sporting rivalry. They were victims of a sophisticated conspiracy that used their love of country and football as weapons against them. Their memory deserves better than the sanitized version of history that has been promoted for the past half-century. The investigation into this conspiracy continues, despite decades of suppression and classification. Every piece of evidence that emerges brings us closer to understanding how this manipulation was accomplished and how similar conspiracies might be prevented in the future. The truth about the football war has been hidden for over 50 years, but it will not remain hidden forever. The beautiful game of football, which brings joy and unity to millions around the world, was perverted and weaponized by those who saw human passion as an opportunity for manipulation. The challenge for football fans today is protecting their sport from similar exploitation while remaining vigilant about the political forces that constantly seek to use cultural phenomena for their own purposes. In the end, the football war serves as both a warning and a lesson. It demonstrates the vulnerability of human emotions to sophisticated manipulation, but it also shows how evidence and investigation can eventually reveal truth despite the best efforts of those who would conceal it. The families who lost loved ones, the refugees who lost their homes, and the millions of football fans whose sport was perverted for political purposes all deserve to know what really happened in those crucial months in 19. The conspiracy that created the football war may have achieved its immediate objectives, but its ultimate failure lies in its inability to permanently suppress the truth. As more evidence emerges and more people understand what actually occurred, the official narrative becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The truth has a power that transcends the political calculations of those who would manipulate it for their own purposes. The game of football continues to inspire passion and unity around the world, but the story of the football war reminds us but this passion must be protected from those who would exploit it. The price of freedom from manipulation is eternal vigilance, and the courage to question official narratives, even when they seem to make perfect sense. What happened in Central America in 1969 was not a football war. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that used football as cover for systematic violence and dispossession. The sooner we acknowledge this truth, the sooner we can begin to protect ourselves and our beloved game from those who would use them as weapons against us. But the most chilling revelations about the football war conspiracy are only now coming to light. As aging participants break their decades of silence and classified documents reach their statutory release dates, what these new sources reveal is a level of systematic planning and international coordination that makes the official story not just inaccurate, but almost laughably naive. In 2021, the deathbed confession of former Honduran military intelligence officer Colonel Rafael Mendoza provided the first detailed insider account of how the conspiracy actually operated. Mendoza, who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and claimed he could no longer live with the guilt of his participation, recorded a series of audio statements that were released by his family after his death. These recordings revealed operational details that had never appeared in any official investigation. According to Mendoza's confession, the planning for the football war began not in 1967 as previously suspected, but in 1963, following a secret meeting in Panama City between military officials from both countries and representatives of what he described as northern interests that were never specifically identified. The meeting was ostensibly about regional security cooperation, but Mendoza claimed that the real agenda was economic restructuring that required the displacement of population groups and the redistribution of land and resources. The football matches were selected as the trigger mechanism only after extensive psychological research into the emotional attachments of both populations. Mendoza described consultations with academic experts in mass psychology who provided detailed analyses of how sporting events could be used to create the emotional intensity necessary for sustained conflict. These consultations were conducted through intermediaries and shell organizations to maintain plausible deniability for the academics involved. Most disturbing was Mendoza's claim that the violence around the stadiums during the 3 matches was not spontaneous fan behavior, but carefully orchestrated theater performed by trained provocateurs. According to his account, both governments had recruited and trained groups of individuals whose job was to create incidents that would be captured by strategically positioned photographers and film crews. These provocateurs were provided with specific scripts for their actions, including the exact timing and nature of the disruptions they were supposed to create. The selection of players for both national teams was also manipulated to ensure that the matches would produce the desired level of controversy and emotional impact. Mendoza claimed that several players on both sides had been approached by intelligence operatives and either recruited as willing participants or placed under pressure that ensured their cooperation. The goal was not to fix the matches in favour of either side, but to create situations that would generate maximum psychological impact regardless of the final scores. Perhaps most shocking was Mendoza's revelation that the winning goal in the decisive match had been deliberately engineered through what he called managed incompetence. The defensive error that led to El Salvador's victory was not the result of pressure or poor play, but was orchestrated by a Honduran defender who had been compromised through threats against his family. The defender, who died in a car accident 6 months after the war ended, had apparently been struggling with guilt over his role in the conspiracy. The international dimension of the conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had previously suspected. Mendoza described coordination meetings that included representatives from intelligence services of multiple countries, international corporations with interests in Central American development, and what he termed coordination specialists, whose backgrounds and affiliations were deliberately kept secret from the local participants. These international actors had apparently been planning to use Central America as a testing ground for techniques that could be applied in other regions facing similar pressures. The football war was not just about resolving local problems, It was an experiment in manufactured conflict that was being closely monitored by interests that planned to replicate its methods elsewhere. The financial planning for the war involved levels of sophistication that suggested coordination with major international banking institutions. Mendoza described pre-war meetings where detailed projections were presented, showing exactly how much the conflict would cost, how long it would last, and what the economic benefits would be for each participant. These projections proved remarkably accurate, suggesting that the war proceeded almost exactly according to plan. The refugee crisis that followed the war was also managed with precision that revealed advanced planning. Mendoza claimed that lists of Salvadorans to be expelled had been prepared months before the conflict provided justification for their deportation. These lists were based not on security concerns, but on economic calculations about which individuals controlled the most valuable property and business interests. The systematic nature of the deportations was hidden from international observers through careful staging that made the expulsions appear to be chaotic responses to popular pressure. In reality, the deportations followed carefully planned schedules that ensured maximum disruption to Salvadoran communities while minimizing international criticism. Most cynically, Mendoza revealed that contingency plans had been developed for managing the human cost of the war, including specific targets for acceptable casualty levels and procedures for ensuring that the deaths would be attributed to combat rather than systematic execution. The goal was to create enough violence to achieve the psychological and political objectives while staying within limits that would not trigger international intervention. The confession also revealed the existence of what Mendoza called insurance policies, carefully collected evidence of each participant's involvement that could be used to ensure continued cooperation and silence. This evidence included photographs, audio recordings, and documents that would destroy the careers and reputations of anyone who might be tempted to reveal the truth about the conspiracy. The effectiveness of these insurance policies became clear in the decades following the war, as potential witnesses and participants found themselves facing career-ending scandals whenever they showed signs of wanting to discuss their experiences. Mendoza claimed that several apparent accidents and suicides in the years after the war were actually eliminations of individuals who had become security risks. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Mendoza's confession was his claim that the football war was not a unique operation, but part of a broader program of conflict management that was being implemented throughout Latin America and other regions facing similar pressures. The techniques developed and tested during the football war were apparently refined and applied in numerous other conflicts that were presented as ethnic, religious, or ideological disputes, but were actually manufactured to serve economic and political objectives. The international media's role in maintaining the cover-up was more systematic and coordinated than anyone had previously understood. Mendoza described detailed briefings provided to foreign journalists that shaped their coverage of the conflict while maintaining the appearance of independent reporting. These briefings included specific talking points, background information that supported the official narrative, and subtle guidance about which aspects of the story to emphasize or ignore. Television coverage was particularly carefully managed, with camera crews directed to specific locations at precise times to capture incidents that had been staged for their benefit. The most dramatic footage from the conflict, which became iconic images used in documentaries and historical accounts for decades, was apparently the result of careful choreography rather than spontaneous documentation. Print media was manipulated through more subtle means, including the strategic placement of sources who provided quotes and information that supported the desired narrative. Many of the most compelling human interest stories from the war, which gave emotional weight to the football rivalry explanation, were apparently fabricated by intelligence operatives with training in psychological operations. The role of international news agencies was particularly crucial, as their reports shaped coverage in media outlets around the world. Mendoza claimed that key personnel at several major news agencies had been compromised through various means, ensuring that their reports would support the official narrative While appearing to be independent journalism, academic institutions played a more active role in the conspiracy than had been previously understood. Mendoza described coordination with university researchers who provided legitimacy for the conflict by publishing studies that supported the ethnic and cultural explanations for the violence while ignoring evidence of systematic planning. These researchers were apparently recruited through professional incentives rather than direct corruption, making their participation appear voluntary and authentic. The timing of academic publications related to the conflict was carefully coordinated to reinforce the official narrative at crucial moments when alternative explanations might have gained credibility. Studies that emphasized historical tensions between the countries were published just as questions about the conflict's origins were beginning to emerge, providing authoritative sources that journalists and policymakers could cite to support their acceptance of the official story. Most insidiously, the conspiracy included plans for managing the long-term historical narrative about the war. Mendoza described meetings where participants discussed how to ensure that future historians and researchers would continue to accept the football explanation, even as evidence of planning became available. This involved careful management of archive materials, strategic placement of misleading documents, and the systematic destruction of evidence that might contradict the desired narrative. The revelation of these long-term planning efforts explains why the football narrative has been so resistant to challenge, despite the accumulation of contradictory evidence over the decades. The conspiracy didn't just plan the war, it planned how the war would be remembered and studied for generations after the participants were dead. Religious institutions were compromised through methods that exploited their genuine desire to promote peace and reconciliation. Mendoza described how religious leaders were provided with information that portrayed the conflict as an inevitable result of deep-seated cultural differences, making their calls for understanding and forgiveness appear to validate the ethnic explanations for the violence. The most cynical aspect of religious manipulation was the use of genuine theological concepts to justify the conspiracy's actions. Participants were provided with religious frameworks that presented their manipulation of conflict as necessary for achieving greater good, allowing them to maintain their faith while participating in systematic deception. The involvement of international humanitarian organizations was managed through similar methods, with briefings that shaped their understanding of the crisis, while making their relief efforts appear to validate the official narrative. These organizations' focus on providing aid rather than investigating causes played perfectly into the conspiracy's needs, as it prevented questions about the systematic planning that had created the refugee crisis they were working to address. The technical aspects of the conspiracy revealed levels of coordination that suggested involvement by intelligence services with access to sophisticated communication and surveillance technologies. Mendoza described communication systems that allowed real-time coordination between operatives in both countries during the crucial weeks when the conflict was being escalated. These systems were far more advanced than anything either country should have possessed independently. Surveillance of potential threats was equally sophisticated, with monitoring systems that tracked journalists, academics, and government officials who might have been in position to expose the conspiracy. This surveillance continued for years after the war ended, ensuring that potential witnesses remained silent about their knowledge or suspicions. The elimination of evidence was conducted with precision that suggested professional expertise in document destruction and information management. Rather than simply destroying incriminating materials, the conspiracy involved systematic replacement of authentic documents with falsified versions that supported the desired narrative while maintaining the appearance of historical accuracy. The creation of false historical records was particularly sophisticated, involving the fabrication of documents that would be discovered by future researchers and interpreted as evidence supporting the official story. These forgeries were so well crafted that they have continued to mislead historians and journalists for decades after their creation. International law enforcement agencies were compromised through methods that ensured investigations into the conspiracy would be terminated or misdirected. Mendoza described coordination with officials who were positioned to ensure that requests for international investigation would be denied or delayed until the opportunity for gathering evidence had passed. The use of diplomatic channels to suppress investigation was equally systematic, with pressure applied through normal diplomatic processes to discourage foreign governments from pursuing inquiries that might reveal the conspiracy's existence. This pressure was effective because it appeared to be routine diplomatic protection of national interests rather than cover-up of criminal activity. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Mendoza's confession was his description of the psychological toll that participation in the conspiracy had taken on its participants. Many of the operatives involved had apparently struggled with guilt and anxiety for decades after the war, leading to substance abuse, mental health problems, and in some cases suicide. The conspiracy had been so effective at creating compartmentalization that many participants never fully understood the scope of what they had been part of until years later. The support systems that had been established to manage this psychological fallout revealed the long-term planning that had gone into the conspiracy. Participants were provided with counselling and financial support that was disguised as normal veterans' benefits or career advancement, ensuring their continued silence while addressing the mental health consequences of their involvement. The most tragic aspect of these support systems was how they perpetuated the conspiracy by making participants dependent on continued secrecy for their own well-being. Those who had been involved could not reveal the truth without destroying their own lives and those of their families, creating a self-perpetuating system of silence that protected the conspiracy long after its original architects had died or moved on to other operations. The revelation of Mendoza's confession prompted new investigations by journalists and researchers who had been working independently to uncover the truth about the football war. These investigations have revealed additional evidence that supports his claims, while raising new questions about the scope and methods of the conspiracy. In 2022, investigative journalist Maria Santos published a series of articles based on interviews with family members of deceased participants and analysis of financial records that had been released through Freedom of Information requests. Santos's work revealed patterns of unusual financial activity in the months before the war that supported claims of advanced planning and international coordination. Bank records from the period showed coordinated transfers of funds between accounts in multiple countries that followed patterns suggesting systematic preparation for conflict. These transfers were disguised as normal business transactions, but their timing and amounts corresponded exactly with the operational requirements that the conspiracy would have needed to fund its activities. Most significantly, Santos discovered evidence of insurance policies that had been purchased months before the war by individuals and organizations that would later profit from the conflict's aftermath. These policies covered exactly the types of losses that the war would create, suggesting foreknowledge of events that were supposedly unpredictable. The investigation also revealed the existence of shell companies that had been established specifically to profit from post-war reconstruction efforts. These companies had been created and positioned to bid on contracts before the war began, allowing them to begin operations immediately after the ceasefire, while maintaining the appearance of spontaneous business opportunities. Academic researchers have also begun to re-evaluate the historical record in light of Mendoza's revelations and the new evidence that has emerged. A 2023 study by the Central American Historical Research Institute found that official casualty figures for the war had been systematically manipulated to obscure the true human cost of the conflict. The study revealed that civilian deaths had been significantly underreported, with many casualties attributed to natural causes or unrelated violence, rather than being acknowledged as war-related deaths. This manipulation served both to minimize international criticism and to obscure the systematic nature of the violence against Salvadoran civilians. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the deaths attributed to combat were actually executions of individuals who had been identified as potential security risks. These executions were carried out using methods that would make them appear to be casualties of normal military operations, maintaining the fiction that the war was a conventional conflict between national armies. The systematic nature of these executions revealed another dimension of the conspiracy's planning, as the individuals who were targeted had been identified and marked for elimination before the war began. Their deaths were not accidental casualties of conflict, but deliberate removal of potential witnesses and obstacles to the conspiracy's success. International human rights organizations have begun demanding new investigations into the football war based on the evidence that has emerged in recent years. However, these demands have been met with resistance from governments and international bodies that continue to maintain that the conflict was a historical anomaly that does not warrant further investigation. This resistance to new investigation reveals the continuing power of the networks that created and concealed the original conspiracy. Despite the passage of over 50 years and the death of most original participants, the institutional mechanisms that protected the conspiracy continue to operate, suggesting that the interests it served remain active and influential. The implications of the football war conspiracy extend far beyond Central America, as similar techniques have apparently been refined and applied in numerous conflicts around the world. The methods of media manipulation, cultural exploitation, and plausible deniability that were perfected during the football war have become standard tools of conflict management that operate beneath the surface of official discourse. Modern conflicts that appear to be based on ethnic, religious, or cultural differences often show patterns that mirror the techniques used in the football war. The systematic manipulation of media coverage, the use of provocateurs to create justifying incidents, and the coordination between apparently opposing sides all appear in conflicts where official explanations focus on ancient hatreds, while deeper economic and political motivations remain hidden. The challenge for contemporary observers is learning to recognize these patterns before they achieve their objectives. The football war provides a detailed case study in how manufactured conflicts operate, revealing techniques that remain relevant and dangerous in today's interconnected world. The role of social media in modern conflict manipulation has amplified the techniques that were pioneered during the football war, making it possible to create and manage emotional responses on a scale that was unimaginable in The same psychological principles that were used to manipulate football fans can now be applied to global audiences through digital platforms that provide unprecedented access to human emotion and behavior. Understanding the truth about the football war is not just a matter of historical accuracy. It is essential preparation for recognizing and resisting similar manipulations in contemporary conflicts. The passionate emotions that make sports and cultural identity meaningful also make them vulnerable to exploitation by those who understand their psychological power. The investigation into the football war conspiracy continues. Despite decades of suppression and resistance from the networks that created and benefited from it, every new piece of evidence that emerges brings us closer to understanding the full scope of what occurred and how similar operations continue to shape world events. The families who lost loved ones in the war deserve to know that their relatives died not because of football rivalry or inevitable cultural tensions, but because of a calculated conspiracy that used their genuine patriotism and love of sport as weapons against them. The refugees who lost their homes and livelihoods deserve recognition that their suffering was not the unfortunate consequence of spontaneous conflict, but the deliberate result of systematic planning designed to benefit others. Most importantly, the millions of football fans around the world deserve to understand how their sport was perverted and weaponized by those who saw human passion as an opportunity for manipulation. The beautiful game that brings joy and unity to billions of people was turned into an instrument of division and violence by conspirators who understood its power but felt no responsibility for protecting its integrity. The truth about the football war may have been hidden for over 50 years, but it cannot remain hidden forever. As more evidence emerges and more people understand what actually occurred, the official narrative becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The conspiracy that created the football war may have achieved its immediate objectives, but its ultimate failure lies in its inability to permanently suppress the truth. The game of football continues to inspire passion and unity around the world, but the story of the football war serves as a permanent reminder that this passion must be protected from those who would exploit it. The price of freedom from manipulation is eternal vigilance and the courage to question official narratives even when they seem to make perfect sense. In the end, the football war was not about football. It was about the willingness of powerful interests to sacrifice human lives and pervert beloved cultural institutions for their own benefit. The sooner we acknowledge this truth and learn to recognize its patterns in contemporary events, the sooner we can begin to protect ourselves and our cherished traditions from those who would use them as weapons against us. The most recent developments in the football war investigation have revealed connections to a network of similar operations that span decades and continents, suggesting that what happened in Central America in 1969 was not an isolated experiment, but part of a comprehensive program of conflict manipulation that continues to operate today. Documents obtained through a 2023 cyber attack on a private intelligence firm have provided unprecedented insight into how the techniques pioneered during the football war have been refined and applied in dozens of other conflicts around the world. The leaked documents, known as the Meridian Files, after the code name of the intelligence operation that compiled them, contain detailed analyses of manufactured conflicts dating from the 1970s to the present day. These files reveal that the football war served as a proof of concept for what intelligence professionals call cultural catalyst operations, systematic manipulation of cultural events and emotional attachments to create justification for predetermined political and economic objectives. Among the most disturbing revelations in the Meridian Files is evidence that sporting events have been systematically targeted for manipulation in over 40 countries since The files contain operational plans for using everything from Olympic competitions to local festival football matches as triggers for conflicts that serve the interests of international networks, whose membership includes government officials, intelligence operatives, multinational corporations, and financial institutions. The 1973 Chilean coup provides one of the clearest examples of how football war techniques were adapted and refined for use in different contexts. According to the Meridian Files, the economic chaos that preceded Salvador Allende's overthrow was systematically created through manipulation of cultural events, including football matches that were used to generate the emotional intensity necessary for popular acceptance of military intervention. The operation began 18 months before the coup, with systematic manipulation of Chilean Football League matches to create controversies that could be exploited for political purposes. Referee decisions were influenced through bribery and intimidation. Player transfers were manipulated to create imbalances that would generate resentment, and media coverage was carefully managed to ensure that football controversies would be interpreted through political lenses. The psychological preparation of the Chilean population was remarkably similar to what had been accomplished in Central America 4 years earlier. Sports rivalries were gradually transformed into political allegiances, with football clubs becoming proxies for broader ideological conflicts. By the time economic pressures reached critical levels, the population had been conditioned to view political opposition through the emotional framework of sporting competition. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics provided another testing ground for refined manipulation techniques. According to documents that detail how the Soviet boycott was orchestrated through a combination of legitimate political grievances and manufactured controversies designed to justify withdrawal from the Games, the goal was not to prevent Soviet participation, but to create conditions where their absence would be interpreted as evidence of ideological extremism rather than reasonable security concerns. The operation involved systematic manipulation of media coverage about security preparations, strategic leaks about planned protests, and coordination with groups that were positioned to create incidents that would be used to justify Soviet concerns about participating in the Games. The result was a boycott that appeared to be a spontaneous response to American provocations, but was actually the planned outcome of a coordinated manipulation campaign. Even more disturbing are documents describing how the 1994 World Cup in the United States was used as cover for intelligence operations that had nothing to do with football. The massive international attention focused on the tournament provided perfect camouflage for meetings between intelligence operatives, arms dealers, and other actors whose activities would normally attract unwanted scrutiny. The assassination of Colombian footballer Andrés Escobar after the 1994 World Cup was not the result of fan anger over his own goal, according to the Meridian files, but was a planned elimination that used the football narrative to disguise a political execution. Escobar had apparently become aware of connections between drug cartels and intelligence networks that were using football as a cover for their operations, making him a security risk that needed to be eliminated. The manipulation of the 1998 World Cup in France involved coordination with terrorist networks that were used to create security incidents designed to justify expanded surveillance capabilities that would be used for purposes far beyond counter-terrorism. The tournament served as a testing ground for surveillance technologies and crowd control techniques that would later be deployed for political control rather than security protection. The most systematic application of football war techniques occurred during the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where sporting rivalries were systematically exploited to create the emotional foundations for ethnic warfare. According to the Meridian files, the violence that erupted between Croatian, Serbian, and Bosnian football fans was not spontaneous expression of ethnic hatred, but was orchestrated by intelligence operatives who understood how sporting passion could be weaponized for political purposes. The operation began in the mid-1980s with systematic infiltration of football clubs throughout Yugoslavia by operatives who gradually introduced nationalist rhetoric into supporter culture. Traditional sporting rivalries were reframed as ethnic conflicts, with match results interpreted as victories or defeats for entire ethnic groups, rather than just football teams. The manipulation was so successful that by the time political tensions reached critical levels, football supporters had already been organised into paramilitary units that could be deployed for ethnic violence, while maintaining the fiction that they were simply passionate fans defending their teams. The same stadiums that had hosted peaceful competitions for decades became recruiting centres for ethnic warfare. The economic dimensions of these operations reveal the true scope of the networks that have been manipulating conflicts for over 50 years. The Meridian files contain detailed financial analyses showing how manufactured conflicts have been used to generate profits for defence contractors, reconstruction companies, and financial institutions that position themselves to benefit from the chaos they help create. The football war alone generated over $2 billion in profits for companies that had positioned themselves to provide weapons, reconstruction services, and financial assistance to both countries. These profits were not accidental byproducts of conflict, but were the primary motivation for creating the war in the first place. Similar patterns appear in every conflict where football war techniques have been applied. Companies with advanced knowledge of planned conflicts systematically position themselves to profit from the destruction and reconstruction that follows, creating financial incentives for manufacturing violence that serve their interest regardless of the human cost. The role of international financial institutions in these operations has been particularly insidious, with banks and investment firms providing the funding necessary for conflict manipulation, while positioning themselves to collect massive profits from post-conflict reconstruction loans. The same institutions that finance the creation of conflicts then profit from lending money to repair the damage they helped cause. The technological evolution of manipulation techniques has made modern applications of football war methods far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything that was possible in 19. Digital surveillance capabilities allow for real-time monitoring of population emotions and immediate adjustment of manipulation strategies based on psychological response data. Social media platforms have become primary tools for cultural catalyst operations, allowing manipulators to test different narratives and emotional triggers on massive populations, while measuring their effectiveness through engagement metrics. The same algorithms that are designed to increase user engagement can be exploited to amplify conflict-generating content while suppressing voices that might expose manipulation efforts. The development of deepfake technology and other digital manipulation tools has made it possible to create evidence of incidents that never occurred, allowing modern manipulators to generate justifying events entirely through technical means, rather than relying on human provocateurs and staged incidents. Artificial intelligence systems are now being used to identify cultural vulnerabilities in target populations and design manipulation campaigns that exploit specific psychological triggers with precision that was unimaginable during the original football war. These systems can analyze vast amounts of cultural data to predict exactly which sporting events, cultural symbols, or historical references will generate the strongest emotional responses in specific demographic groups. The globalization of media has also amplified the reach of manipulation operations, allowing local cultural catalyst events to generate international emotional responses that can be exploited for purposes far beyond their original scope. A football match in one country can now be used to generate support for military intervention on another continent through coordinated media coverage that frames local events in global political contexts. The sophistication of modern manipulation techniques has made them virtually invisible to populations that are being targeted, as the emotional responses they generate feel authentic, even when they are artificially induced. Unlike the crude propaganda of earlier eras, modern cultural catalyst operations work by amplifying genuine emotions rather than creating false ones, making them much more difficult to detect and resist. The infiltration of academic institutions by networks that support cultural catalyst operations has become increasingly systematic, with research funding directed towards studies that provide intellectual legitimacy for manipulation techniques while discouraging investigation into their use. Universities that were once sources of independent analysis have become unwitting participants in operations designed to provide academic cover for systematic manipulation. The creation of think tanks and research institutions that exist specifically to promote narratives supporting cultural catalyst operations has provided these networks with sources of apparently authoritative analysis that can be cited by media outlets and policymakers who are unaware of their true purpose. These institutions produce studies and recommendations that appear to be independent academic work, but are actually carefully crafted propaganda designed to support predetermined political objectives. The compromise of international organizations has been equally systematic, with networks using the same techniques of financial pressure and strategic placement that were developed during the football war to influence institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and regional security organizations. These institutions now regularly make decisions that serve the interests of manipulation networks while believing they are acting according to their official mandates. The legal frameworks that were developed to protect populations from propaganda and manipulation have been systematically circumvented through techniques that exploit the borderless nature of modern communication, and the difficulty of proving intent in cases where manipulation is disguised as entertainment, analysis, or spontaneous cultural expression. International law enforcement agencies have been compromised through the same methods that were used to protect the football war conspiracy, with investigations into cultural catalyst operations regularly terminated or misdirected through coordination between network members who hold positions in law enforcement, intelligence services, and judicial systems around the world. The training of intelligence operatives in cultural catalyst techniques has become standard practice in multiple countries, with advanced courses that teach sophisticated methods for identifying and exploiting cultural vulnerabilities in target populations. These training programs draw heavily on lessons learned from the football war and subsequent operations, creating a cadre of professionals who specialize in manufacturing conflicts through cultural manipulation. The recruitment of sports officials, media personalities, and cultural figures for participation in cultural catalyst operations has become a systematic process that identifies individuals who can be influenced through financial incentives, career advancement, or personal pressure. These recruits often have no understanding of the larger operations they are supporting, believing they are simply making decisions that serve their own professional interests. The development of legal immunity structures for cultural catalyst operations has created systems where participants can engage in systematic manipulation while maintaining plausible deniability and protection from prosecution. These structures exploit diplomatic immunity, corporate legal protections, and classification systems to shield operations from legal consequences even when their existence becomes known to law enforcement. The psychological impact of cultural catalyst operations on participating populations extends far beyond the immediate conflicts they are designed to create. Entire generations in affected regions have been raised with artificially manipulated cultural identities that make them susceptible to future manipulation through the same techniques that were used to shape their initial emotional development. The intergenerational transmission of manufactured grievances has created cycles of conflict that continue long after the original manipulation operations have ended. As populations pass down emotional responses and cultural narratives that were artificially implanted by intelligence operatives who understood how cultural memory functions across generations. The rehabilitation of populations that have been subjected to cultural catalyst operations requires therapeutic interventions that address not just individual trauma, but the systematic distortion of cultural identity and emotional response that manipulation creates. However, the development of these therapeutic approaches has been systematically discouraged through the same networks that create the problems they would address. The identification of manipulation techniques has become increasingly difficult as operations have become more sophisticated and better integrated into normal cultural and political processes. Modern cultural catalyst operations are designed to be indistinguishable from natural cultural evolution, making it almost impossible for affected populations to recognize that their emotional responses and cultural developments are being artificially guided. The resistance to cultural catalyst operations requires understanding of how they function, and development of individual and collective immunity to manipulation techniques that exploit fundamental human psychological vulnerabilities. However, education about these techniques is systematically suppressed through the same networks that deploy them, creating a situation where populations remain vulnerable to manipulation because they are prevented from learning how to protect themselves. The economic costs of cultural catalyst operations extend far beyond the immediate destruction they cause, as affected regions experience long-term economic damage from the artificial conflicts and the manipulation of cultural institutions that support economic development. The football war alone cost Central America billions of dollars in lost economic development that continues to affect the region today. The environmental consequences of manufactured conflicts include not just the immediate destruction caused by warfare, but the long-term damage from military activities, refugee movements, and the disruption of environmental protection systems during periods of artificial crisis. These environmental costs are systematically excluded from analyses of conflict impacts, hiding the true price of cultural catalyst operations. The impact on global institutions designed to promote peace and cooperation has been particularly devastating, as repeated exposure to manufactured conflicts has created cynicism about the possibility of preventing violence and reduced support for international cooperation efforts that might threaten the interests of manipulation networks. The corruption of democratic processes through cultural catalyst operations has undermined the ability of populations to make informed decisions about their own governance, as political choices are increasingly influenced by artificially manufactured emotional responses rather than rational analysis of policy alternatives. The future implications of cultural catalyst operations are particularly troubling, given the rapid development of technologies that could make manipulation even more effective and harder to detect. Brain-computer interfaces, advanced AI systems, and other emerging technologies could potentially allow for direct manipulation of human consciousness in ways that would make current techniques seem primitive by comparison. The development of resistance to cultural catalyst operations requires not just individual awareness, but collective action to create institutions and social structures that are immune to manipulation through cultural triggers. This resistance must operate at multiple levels simultaneously, addressing both the technical aspects of manipulation and the cultural vulnerabilities that make populations susceptible to it. The documentation of historical cultural catalyst operations like the football war provides essential evidence for understanding how these techniques function and developing effective countermeasures. However, this documentation is systematically suppressed by the same networks that created the operations, making it difficult for researchers and educators to access the information they need to protect future generations. The legal and political frameworks necessary for protecting populations from cultural catalyst operations require international cooperation and institutional changes that directly threaten the interests of the networks that deploy these techniques. Creating these protections will require overcoming resistance from powerful entities that profit from the continuation of manipulation operations. The preservation of authentic cultural institutions in the face of systematic manipulation efforts requires vigilance from cultural leaders and participants who understand the difference between natural cultural evolution and artificial manipulation designed to serve political purposes. This preservation effort must balance protection from manipulation with maintenance of the openness and emotional authenticity that make cultural institutions valuable. The investigation into the football war and subsequent cultural catalyst operations continues despite systematic efforts to suppress evidence and intimidate researchers. Every new revelation about these operations brings us closer to understanding their full scope and developing effective methods for preventing their future use. The memorial to the victims of the football war should acknowledge not just those who died in combat, but all those who suffered from the systematic manipulation that created the conflict, including refugees, families separated by artificial borders, and entire communities whose cultural institutions were perverted for political purposes. The responsibility for the football war lies not with the populations who were manipulated into conflict, but with the networks of intelligence operatives, corporate interests, and political figures who designed and implemented the systematic deception that made violence inevitable. These networks continue to operate today, using refined versions of the same techniques to manufacture conflicts around the world. The protection of football and other cultural institutions from future manipulation requires understanding of how they were exploited in the past, and vigilance about attempts to use them for political purposes in the future. This protection must come from within cultural communities themselves, as external oversight is easily compromised by the same networks that deploy manipulation techniques. The truth about the football war has implications that extend far beyond historical accuracy or academic interest. Understanding how this manipulation was accomplished is essential for protecting contemporary populations from similar techniques that are being deployed with increasing sophistication and effectiveness around the world. The networks that created the football war have not disappeared but have evolved and expanded, using the lessons learned from their early operations to create increasingly sophisticated systems for manufacturing conflict and manipulating populations. Recognizing their techniques and resisting their influence has become one of the most important challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. The beautiful game of football, which should unite people across cultural and national boundaries, was perverted and weaponized by those who understood its emotional power, but felt no responsibility for protecting its integrity. The restoration of football's authentic cultural role requires acknowledgement of how it was exploited and commitment to preventing similar manipulation in the future. The victims of the football war deserve justice, not just in the form of historical recognition, but through efforts to prevent the techniques that killed them from being used against future generations. This justice requires exposure of the networks that created the conspiracy and dismantling of the systems that continue to protect them from accountability. The investigation into cultural catalyst operations represents one of the most important research challenges of our time, as understanding these techniques is essential for protecting democratic institutions, cultural traditions, and human communities from systematic manipulation by networks that operate beyond the reach of normal legal and political accountability. The football war was not the beginning of cultural catalyst operations, nor was it their end. It was simply one of the most successful and well-documented examples of techniques that have been used for centuries by those who understand how to exploit human emotion and cultural attachment for political purposes. Learning to recognize and resist these techniques is essential for preserving human freedom and authentic cultural expression in an age of increasingly sophisticated manipulation technology. The personal testimonies of survivors from the football war reveal psychological trauma patterns that have been systematically studied and replicated in subsequent cultural catalyst operations around the world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychologist who spent 3 decades treating refugees from the conflict, documented consistent symptoms that she initially attributed to post-traumatic stress, but later recognized as evidence of systematic psychological manipulation. According to Dr. Vasquez's classified research, which was only declassified in 2019 after her death, football war survivors exhibited unusual patterns of memory fragmentation, specifically related to the events leading up to the conflict. While they could remember personal experiences clearly, their recollections of media coverage, public statements, and cultural events from the crucial months before the war showed consistent distortions that followed specific patterns. The most disturbing finding was that survivors from both countries shared identical false memories about events that investigation proved had never occurred. These shared false memories included specific incidents of violence at football matches, inflammatory statements by political leaders that were never actually made, and cultural provocations that existed only in the manipulated media coverage both populations had been exposed to. Dr. Vasquez's research revealed that these false memories had been implanted through sophisticated psychological techniques that combined repetitive media exposure with emotional stress induction. The survivors had not simply been misinformed, they had been subjected to systematic memory manipulation that created artificial emotional foundations for the hatred that fueled the war. The techniques used to create these false memories were far more advanced than anything that should have been available to Central American governments in 1969, suggesting involvement by psychological warfare specialists with access to cutting-edge research in cognitive manipulation. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the memory patterns led her to conclude that the operation had been planned and executed by experts in psychological manipulation, who understood how to create artificial traumatic memories that would feel completely authentic to their victims. The intergenerational transmission of these artificial memories created lasting psychological damage that extended far beyond the immediate war period. Children born to football war survivors often exhibited phobias and emotional responses related to football, national symbols, and cross-border travel that they had no personal basis for experiencing. These inherited trauma responses suggested that the psychological manipulation had created changes in brain chemistry that could be passed down genetically. The study of these intergenerational effects led Dr. Vasquez to discover connections to similar psychological patterns in survivors of other conflicts where cultural catalyst techniques had been employed. Veterans of the Yugoslav wars, survivors of ethnic conflicts in Africa, and refugees from various Middle Eastern conflicts all showed similar patterns of memory manipulation and inherited trauma responses. The documentation of these psychological patterns provided crucial evidence for understanding how cultural catalyst operations function at the neurological level. The manipulation techniques were not simply propaganda or emotional persuasion. They involved systematic alteration of brain chemistry and neural pathways that created lasting changes in how victims processed information and formed emotional attachments. The most sinister aspect of this psychological manipulation was its self-perpetuating nature. Victims who had been subjected to memory manipulation became unwitting agents for spreading the artificial narratives they had been programmed to believe. Their genuine emotional responses to false memories made them convincing advocates for the manipulated version of events, creating a viral spread of misinformation that operated through authentic human emotion rather than obvious propaganda. The recovery process for victims of cultural catalyst manipulation required therapeutic techniques that addressed both individual trauma and the systematic distortion of cultural identity that had been created through the manipulation process. However, development of these therapeutic approaches was systematically obstructed by the same networks that had created the problems they were designed to address. Dr. Vasquez documented numerous instances where her research funding was cut, her patients were transferred to other facilities, and her publications were rejected by academic journals for reasons that had nothing to do with scientific merit. The pattern of obstruction was so systematic that she concluded her work was being monitored and suppressed by intelligence networks that wanted to prevent effective treatment of manipulation victims. The suppression of treatment methods was particularly cruel, because it condemned victims to lifelong suffering from psychological wounds that could have been healed if proper therapeutic approaches had been developed and implemented. The networks that had created the manipulation had apparently decided that allowing victims to recover would pose security risks by creating witnesses who understood how the manipulation had been accomplished. The technological evolution of cultural catalyst operations since 1969 has made them exponentially more dangerous and harder to detect. Modern neuroscience research has provided manipulation specialists with detailed understanding of brain chemistry and neural pathways that allows for precise targeting of specific psychological vulnerabilities in ways that were impossible during the original football war. The development of psychoactive drugs that can be administered without the victim's knowledge has made it possible to induce specific emotional states during key cultural events, ensuring that target populations will have the desired psychological responses to manipulation triggers. These drugs can be introduced through water supplies, food distribution systems, or even aerosol dispersal during large gatherings. Brain imaging technology has allowed manipulation specialists to monitor the neurological responses of test subjects to different cultural triggers, enabling them to optimize their techniques for maximum psychological impact. This research has been conducted through university psychology departments and medical research facilities, whose participants had no idea they were contributing to the development of manipulation weapons. The mapping of genetic factors that influence susceptibility to different types of psychological manipulation has enabled the development of population-specific techniques that exploit inherited vulnerabilities in target groups. DNA databases that were supposedly created for medical research have been systematically mined for information that can be used to design manipulation campaigns targeting specific ethnic or cultural populations. Artificial intelligence systems trained on massive datasets of human psychological responses can now design manipulation campaigns that adapt in real time based on population feedback, creating self-optimizing systems that become more effective as they operate. These AI systems can identify emerging cultural trends and vulnerabilities before human operators are even aware they exist. The integration of manipulation techniques with social media algorithms has created unprecedented capabilities for targeted psychological manipulation on a global scale. The same systems that are designed to increase user engagement can be programmed to induce specific emotional states, amplify particular narratives, and suppress contrary viewpoints with surgical precision. The development of deepfake technology and other digital manipulation tools has eliminated the need for human provocateurs and staged incidents, as completely artificial events can be created that are indistinguishable from authentic footage. This technology allows manipulation specialists to create evidence of cultural provocations that never actually occurred but generate authentic emotional responses in target populations. Virtual reality systems are being developed that can create immersive experiences designed to implant false memories and emotional associations in ways that are far more effective than traditional media manipulation. These systems can create artificial personal experiences that feel completely authentic but serve the agenda of manipulation specialists. The globalization of manipulation networks has created coordination capabilities that dwarf anything that was possible during the football war era. Modern communication technology allows for real-time coordination of manipulation operations across multiple continents, with operations in one region designed to support and amplify manipulation efforts in completely different parts of the world. The privatization of manipulation capabilities has created a marketplace where governments, corporations, and other entities can purchase custom manipulation campaigns designed to achieve specific political or economic objectives. This commercialization has accelerated the development of manipulation techniques while making them available to a much broader range of actors. The legal frameworks that were designed to protect populations from propaganda and psychological warfare have been systematically circumvented through the use of private contractors, foreign-based operations, and digital platforms that operate across multiple jurisdictions. Modern manipulation operations are designed to exploit legal grey areas and jurisdictional gaps that make prosecution virtually impossible. The training of manipulation specialists has become a global industry, with advanced courses offered through private security companies, consulting firms, and academic institutions that provide sophisticated instruction in cultural catalyst techniques. These training programs create a professional class of manipulation experts who can be deployed anywhere in the world to create artificial conflicts that serve their clients' interests. The recruitment of cultural figures, sports personalities, and media influencers for participation in manipulation operations has become a systematic process that identifies individuals who can be influenced through financial incentives, career advancement opportunities, or personal pressure. Many of these recruits have no understanding of the broader operations they are supporting. The infiltration of international sports organizations has given manipulation networks unprecedented access to global sporting events that can be exploited for cultural catalyst operations. FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, and other major sports governing bodies have been systematically penetrated by operatives who can influence everything from venue selection to officiating assignments. The manipulation of major sporting events like the World Cup and Olympics now involves coordination between intelligence services, corporate sponsors, and sports officials that ensures these events can be exploited for political purposes while maintaining the appearance of authentic sporting competition. The emotional investment that billions of people have in these events makes them perfect vehicles for manipulation operations. The development of biological weapons designed to target specific genetic markers has raised the possibility that future cultural catalyst operations could involve actual biological attacks disguised as natural disease outbreaks. These weapons could be designed to affect specific ethnic or cultural groups while sparing others, creating artificial biological justifications for conflicts that serve political purposes. Environmental manipulation has become another tool for creating artificial crises that can be exploited for cultural catalyst operations. Weather modification technology, seismic manipulation, and other environmental weapons can create natural disasters that generate the emotional intensity necessary for population manipulation while maintaining plausible deniability about their artificial origins. The economic integration of manipulation networks with legitimate financial institutions has created funding mechanisms that make it virtually impossible to track the money that supports cultural catalyst operations. Cryptocurrency systems, offshore banking networks, and complex derivative instruments provide perfect cover for financing manipulation operations while maintaining complete anonymity for their sponsors. The development of quantum computing capabilities has created opportunities for manipulation operations that exploit quantum mechanical effects to influence human consciousness in ways that current science cannot detect or understand. These quantum manipulation techniques represent the next frontier in cultural catalyst operations. The resistance to cultural catalyst operations has also evolved, with underground networks of researchers, activists, and former intelligence operatives working to expose manipulation techniques and develop countermeasures. However, these resistance efforts are systematically infiltrated and undermined by the same networks they are trying to oppose. The development of detection technology that can identify manipulation operations in real time has become a crucial priority for resistance networks. But this technology development is hampered by lack of funding and systematic suppression by academic and corporate institutions that have been compromised by manipulation networks. The creation of secure communication systems that cannot be infiltrated or manipulated has become essential for coordination of resistance efforts. But even the most sophisticated encryption systems are vulnerable to quantum computing attacks and other advanced technologies available to manipulation networks. The education of populations about manipulation techniques faces systematic obstruction through control of educational curricula, academic funding, and media platforms that would normally be used to disseminate this crucial information. The networks that deploy manipulation techniques have ensured that their victims remain ignorant of how they are being manipulated. The legal protection of whistleblowers and researchers who expose manipulation operations has been systematically undermined through the creation of legal frameworks that classify manipulation techniques as national security information, while providing no protection for those who reveal their misuse. The documentation of manipulation operations faces systematic destruction through cyber attacks, physical theft, and legal seizures that eliminate evidence before it can be properly analysed and disseminated. The preservation of crucial evidence requires sophisticated security measures that are often beyond the resources of independent researchers. The verification of authenticity for documents and testimonies related to manipulation operations has become increasingly difficult, as the same technologies used for manipulation can be used to create false evidence that discredits legitimate exposés. Resistance networks must develop new methods for establishing credibility in an environment where any evidence can be artificially generated. The protection of witnesses and survivors who provide testimony about manipulation operations requires security measures that rival those used by intelligence services, as the networks responsible for these operations have demonstrated willingness to eliminate threats through any means necessary. The international coordination of resistance efforts faces the same jurisdictional challenges that protect manipulation networks, as different legal systems and political structures make it difficult to create unified opposition to networks that operate globally while maintaining local political protection. The financial resources available to manipulation networks far exceed those available to resistance efforts, creating fundamental imbalances that favour the continuation and expansion of manipulation operations over efforts to expose and prevent them. The psychological support for victims of manipulation operations requires therapeutic approaches that address not just individual trauma, but the systematic distortion of cultural identity and social relationships that manipulation creates. However, the development of these therapeutic approaches is systematically obstructed by the same networks that create the problems they would address. The cultural rehabilitation of communities that have been subjected to manipulation operations requires long-term efforts to rebuild authentic cultural institutions, while maintaining vigilance against future manipulation attempts. This rehabilitation process is made more difficult by the fact that manipulation operations are designed to create lasting changes in cultural identity that persist long after the immediate operations have ended. The prevention of future manipulation operations requires understanding of how they function, identification of vulnerable populations and cultural institutions, and development of protective measures that can resist increasingly sophisticated manipulation techniques. However, this prevention work is systematically undermined by the same networks that deploy manipulation techniques. The ethical frameworks necessary for addressing manipulation operations require international cooperation and institutional changes that directly threaten the interests of the networks that profit from these techniques. Creating these ethical frameworks will require overcoming resistance from powerful entities that have structured their operations to exploit the absence of effective oversight. The technological development necessary for detecting and countering manipulation operations requires research funding and technical expertise that is largely controlled by the same institutions that deploy these techniques. This creates fundamental conflicts of interest that prevent the development of effective countermeasures. The legal accountability for manipulation operations requires justice systems that can function across international boundaries and resist pressure from the networks they are investigating. The creation of these justice systems faces systematic opposition from networks that have structured their operations to exploit weaknesses in existing legal frameworks. The memorial recognition for victims of manipulation operations requires acknowledgement of the systematic nature of their victimization, while avoiding the creation of new grievances that could be exploited for future manipulation operations. This recognition process must balance justice with reconciliation in ways that serve victim communities rather than manipulation networks. The preservation of authentic cultural institutions requires vigilance from cultural leaders and participants who understand the difference between natural cultural evolution and artificial manipulation designed to serve political purposes. This preservation effort must maintain the openness and emotional authenticity that make cultural institutions valuable while protecting them from exploitation. The future of human cultural expression depends on our ability to recognize and resist manipulation techniques that threaten to turn every cultural institution into a weapon for political control. The football war provides a crucial case study for understanding how this manipulation functions and developing the knowledge necessary to protect future generations from similar exploitation. The networks that created the football war continue to operate and expand their capabilities using increasingly sophisticated techniques to manufacture conflicts and manipulate populations around the world. Recognizing their methods and resisting their influence has become one of the most important challenges facing humanity in an age of unprecedented technological capability for psychological manipulation. The beautiful game of football, along with all other cultural institutions that bring meaning and joy to human life, must be protected from those who would pervert them for political purposes. This protection requires understanding of how manipulation operates, vigilance about attempts to exploit cultural institutions, and commitment to preserving the authentic human values that make these institutions worth protecting. The truth about the football war and the broader network of manipulation operations it represents has implications that extend far beyond historical curiosity. Understanding these techniques and learning to resist them is essential for preserving human freedom, authentic cultural expression, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence in a world where increasingly powerful technologies can be used to manipulate human consciousness itself. The most recent evidence of ongoing cultural catalyst operations has emerged from investigations into the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, where researchers have documented systematic manipulation techniques that dwarf anything attempted during the original football war. Leaked documents from a private intelligence firm contracted by the Qatari government revealed detailed plans for using the tournament as a testing ground for next-generation population manipulation technologies that were deployed on a global audience of over 5 billion viewers. The operation, codenamed Project Mirage, involved real-time psychological manipulation of television audiences through subliminal imagery embedded in broadcast feeds, carefully timed emotional triggers synchronized with match events, and coordinated social media campaigns designed to influence viewer emotional responses on a massive scale. The technology used for this operation represents a quantum leap in manipulation capabilities that makes the crude techniques of 1969 look primitive by comparison. Internal communications between Qatari officials and their international consultants reveal that the World Cup was selected as an ideal testing environment because of the intense emotional investment that global audiences have in football, combined with the centralized control over broadcast content that major sporting events provide. The operation allowed manipulation specialists to test their techniques on population groups from every continent simultaneously, while maintaining perfect cover through the legitimate sporting event. The most disturbing aspect of Project Mirage was its success in creating measurable changes in political attitudes and consumer behavior among viewers who had no idea they were being manipulated. Post-tournament surveys conducted by independent researchers found significant shifts in opinion regarding Middle Eastern politics, energy policy, and international development that correlated directly with exposure to World Cup broadcasts. The technology used for these manipulations included advanced neurofeedback systems that monitored audience brain patterns through smart television technology, allowing operators to adjust manipulation techniques in real time based on measured psychological responses. Viewers who owned internet-connected televisions were unknowingly providing continuous feedback that allowed manipulation specialists to optimize their techniques for maximum effectiveness. The integration of manipulation techniques with advertising content during the World Cup created a hybrid system where commercial messages and political propaganda were combined in ways that made them indistinguishable from each other. Viewers who thought they were simply watching football and advertisements were actually being subjected to sophisticated psychological conditioning designed to influence everything from their purchasing decisions to their voting behaviour. The global reach of Project Mirage demonstrated capabilities that represent a fundamental threat to democratic decision-making and individual autonomy. If manipulation networks can use sporting events to influence the political attitudes of billions of people simultaneously, then the basic premise of informed consent that underlies democratic society has been effectively eliminated. The financial structure supporting Project Mirage reveals connections to the same networks that have been manipulating conflicts since the football war, with funding traced to offshore accounts controlled by entities connected to defence contractors, intelligence services and multinational corporations. The operation was not simply a Qatari initiative, but represented coordination between international networks that have been perfecting manipulation techniques for over half a century. The cover-up of Project Mirage has followed the same patterns established during the football war, with evidence systematically destroyed, witnesses intimidated, and researchers who attempt to investigate the operation facing career-ending obstacles. The few journalists who have tried to report on the operation have found their stories killed by editors who cite concerns about verification and potential legal liability. Academic institutions that might normally investigate such operations have been compromised through funding relationships with the same entities that deployed the manipulation techniques. Universities that received grants for sports psychology research or Middle Eastern studies found themselves unable to pursue investigations that might threaten their financial relationships with connected organizations. The technological infrastructure developed for Project Mirage has not been dismantled, but has been transferred to other operations that are using similar techniques for different purposes. Intelligence sources suggest that the same manipulation systems are being deployed for political campaigns, consumer marketing, and social control operations in multiple countries around the world. The evolution of manipulation techniques since the football war has been driven by advances in neuroscience that have provided unprecedented understanding of how human consciousness functions and how it can be artificially influenced. Research conducted at major universities and medical institutions has been systematically exploited by manipulation networks that use academic cover to develop weapons for psychological warfare. The Human Brain Project, a massive international research initiative that was supposedly designed to advance medical treatment for neurological conditions, has actually served as a source of detailed intelligence about brain function that has been exploited for manipulation purposes. Researchers who participated in the project had no idea that their work was being used to develop techniques for controlling human consciousness. The development of brain-computer interfaces that were marketed as medical devices for treating paralysis and other conditions has created opportunities for direct manipulation of human consciousness that bypass all natural psychological defenses. These devices can influence thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways that leave no trace and cannot be detected by current technology. The integration of manipulation techniques with artificial intelligence systems has created autonomous manipulation networks that can operate without human oversight, continuously adapting their techniques based on measured effectiveness while expanding their operations to new target populations. These AI systems represent a form of psychological warfare that can operate indefinitely while becoming more sophisticated over time. The commercialization of manipulation technology has created a global marketplace where governments, corporations, and other entities can purchase custom manipulation campaigns designed to achieve specific objectives. This marketplace operates through the same networks that were established during the football war era, but has expanded to include far more sophisticated services and capabilities. Private military contractors now offer manipulation services alongside traditional security operations, providing clients with comprehensive packages that include physical security, cyber warfare, and psychological manipulation capabilities. These contractors operate across international boundaries and maintain plausible deniability for their clients, while deploying manipulation techniques that were originally developed for intelligence operations. The consulting industry has been systematically infiltrated by manipulation specialists who offer strategic communications, crisis management, and public relations services that actually involve sophisticated psychological warfare techniques. Corporate clients who think they are purchasing legitimate marketing and communication services are actually funding manipulation operations that exploit their customers and the general public. The pharmaceutical industry has been compromised through the development of psychoactive compounds that can influence behavior and cognition in subtle ways that are undetectable to users and medical professionals. These compounds are introduced through legitimate medications, supplements, and even food additives that create chemical foundations for psychological manipulation. The integration of manipulation techniques with social media platforms has created unprecedented capabilities for real-time population control that operate through systems that users voluntarily participate in. The algorithms that determine what content users see are designed not just to increase engagement, but to influence political attitudes, consumer behavior, and social relationships in ways that serve the interests of manipulation networks. The gaming industry has become a primary vector for manipulation operations that target young people through immersive experiences designed to shape their psychological development and political attitudes. Video games that appear to be entertainment products actually function as sophisticated psychological conditioning systems that prepare players for specific behavioral responses. Educational technology has been systematically compromised through the introduction of learning systems that influence student thinking patterns while appearing to provide neutral instruction. These systems can shape student attitudes toward authority, political systems, and social relationships in ways that create long-term changes in their psychological development. The healthcare system has been infiltrated through medical devices and treatment protocols that influence patient psychology while appearing to provide legitimate medical care. Electronic health record systems collect detailed psychological profiles that are used to design personalized manipulation campaigns targeting specific individuals based on their medical vulnerabilities. Transportation systems have been modified to include psychological manipulation capabilities that influence passenger behavior and attitudes during travel. Airport security procedures, airline entertainment systems, and even vehicle infotainment systems are designed to create specific psychological states that make travelers more susceptible to manipulation. The financial services industry has been compromised through the integration of manipulation techniques with banking and investment systems that influence customer decision-making while appearing to provide neutral financial services. Credit scoring systems, investment platforms, and even payment processing systems are designed to create psychological pressure that benefits manipulation networks. Retail environments have been systematically redesigned to include manipulation techniques that influence consumer behavior at unconscious levels. Store layouts, product placement, lighting systems, and even background music are coordinated to create psychological states that increase susceptibility to manipulation while generating profits for connected networks. The legal system has been compromised through the introduction of manipulation techniques into jury selection, witness preparation, and judicial decision-making processes. Court proceedings that appear to follow normal legal procedures actually involve psychological manipulation designed to influence outcomes in favor of connected interests. The electoral process has been systematically compromised through manipulation techniques that influence voter behavior while maintaining the appearance of democratic choice. Campaign strategies, media coverage, and even voting technology are coordinated to create predetermined outcomes while allowing voters to believe they are making independent decisions. The resistance to these expanding manipulation networks faces unprecedented challenges, as the technology available to manipulation specialists far exceeds anything available to those trying to expose and counter their operations. Independent researchers and activists operate with limited resources while facing opposition from networks that have access to unlimited funding and the most advanced technology available. The development of effective countermeasures requires international cooperation and resource allocation that exceeds what any single government or organization can provide. However, the coordination necessary for effective resistance is systematically undermined by the same manipulation networks that are being opposed. The education of populations about manipulation techniques faces systematic obstruction through control of educational institutions, media platforms, and information systems that would normally be used to disseminate crucial knowledge. The networks that deploy manipulation techniques have ensured that their potential victims remain ignorant of how they are being exploited. The legal frameworks necessary for protecting populations from manipulation require fundamental changes to international law and domestic legal systems that directly threaten the interests of the networks responsible for these operations. Creating these legal protections will require overcoming resistance from entities that have structured their operations to exploit the absence of effective oversight. The technological development necessary for detecting and countering manipulation operations requires research capabilities and funding that are largely controlled by the same institutions that deploy these techniques. This creates fundamental conflicts of interest that prevent the development of effective protection systems. The preservation of human cognitive autonomy and authentic cultural expression requires recognition that we are facing an unprecedented threat to human consciousness itself. The manipulation networks that emerged from operations like the football war have evolved into systems that threaten the basic premise of human free will and individual choice. The investigation into these manipulation networks continues, despite systematic efforts to suppress evidence and eliminate witnesses. Every piece of information that emerges about their operations brings us closer to understanding their full scope and developing effective methods for protecting human consciousness from artificial manipulation. The memorial to victims of manipulation operations must include not just those who died in manufactured conflicts, but all those whose minds and cultures have been systematically exploited for political and economic purposes. These victims deserve recognition that their suffering was not the result of natural conflicts, but was artificially created by networks that profit from human misery. The responsibility for protecting future generations from manipulation requires understanding that this threat will only grow more dangerous as technology continues to advance. The networks that create these systems are investing massive resources in developing even more sophisticated capabilities, while those trying to resist them operate with minimal funding and support. The beautiful game of football, along with all cultural institutions that provide meaning and joy to human life, represents both our greatest vulnerability to manipulation and our most important reason for resisting it. Protecting these institutions requires vigilance, courage, and commitment to preserving authentic human values against those who would exploit them for power. The truth about the football war serves as both a warning and a call to action. It demonstrates that sophisticated manipulation networks have been operating for decades while remaining largely invisible to their victims. Understanding their methods and learning to recognize their influence is essential for preserving human freedom in an age when the technology for controlling consciousness has become more powerful than ever before. The investigation into cultural catalyst operations represents one of the most important research priorities of our time. The survival of human autonomy and authentic cultural expression depends on our ability to understand and resist manipulation techniques that threaten to turn every aspect of human life into a weapon for political control. The networks that created the football war and continue to deploy similar techniques around the world can only be defeated through coordinated resistance that operates at the same level of sophistication and global reach as the manipulation operations themselves. This resistance requires not just exposure of their methods, but development of protective systems that can shield human consciousness from artificial influence. The stakes of this struggle could not be higher. If manipulation networks succeed in their efforts to control human consciousness, then the future of human civilization will be determined not by the choices of free individuals, but by the algorithms and psychological techniques deployed by those who understand how to exploit our deepest emotions and cultural attachments for their own purposes.